Offshore and exempt from tax, the Paradise Papers have revealed how the very rich store their money. It's all perfectly legal, but should it be? This is Roundtable with me, Vanessa Cuddiford. More than 13 million leaked documents have shown the complex structures used to invest money offshore in havens, it's claimed, to protect clients from paying tax. Used by celebrities, business people, politicians, and even Britain's Queen. The details have put the extremely wealthy and where they put their money under scrutiny.
Cash flows of the world's rich and powerful have always been a closely held secret. But recent leaks have shined a light on the otherwise clandestine world of offshore finance. Firms that prioritize discretion above all else, and clients who value their privacy. These offshore financial structures may be legal, but are they morally bankrupt? And what would change if governments moved against them? Two of history's largest data leaks have involved tax havens. 11.5 million documents, known as the Panama Papers, detailing offshore accounts, became public in 2016. And this year, more than 13 million documents, dubbed the Paradise Papers, were leaked. Anyone can be forgiven for wanting to make their tax bill smaller. But are the rich playing by a different set of rules? Personal and business taxes in these tax havens are either very low or non-existent. Businesses can avoid high corporation tax, while individuals can significantly decrease their income tax liability. Tax havens are known for their discretion and being a safe place for money to get lost.
It's a black box. You can't tell the difference between the different people who've got their money there, whether that's the Queen or whether that's, as in one case we found, North Korea trying to evade sanctions.
The European Union says it's working to make tax havens a thing of the past. The cost to member countries is estimated to be tens of billions of dollars each year.
Who loses? Schools, hospitals, housing, all those public services lose.
But offshore finance companies are standing their ground. Appleby, the firm at the heart of the Paradise Papers leak, released a statement saying they have thoroughly and vigorously investigated the allegations and are satisfied that there is no evidence of any wrongdoing. Closing loopholes might not be enough. The biggest companies may always be able to shop around for the best tax deal. So long as countries are willing to outbid one another, the system will survive.
I'm joined today by Courtney-Guy, a reporter at World Weekly. Also with me is Head of Advocacy at Transparency International, Davies Teka. George Turner, who's a researcher and analyst at Tax Justice Network, and Diego Zuluaga, Financial Services Specialist at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Thank you all for joining me. Let's start where that report ended then. Will anything change, or as long as there are countries willing to outbid each other, will everything remain the same, Sam?
Well, I think that's a good point to start on. Ultimately, every country is a tax haven compared to another country. As to whether anything will change, you have to remember we can't just sort of suddenly make a lot of these schemes illegal. This is a work in progress. This is something that's been going on for several years now. We've had several major initiatives, including major legislation in the US dating back at least 7 years. We've got the Common Reporting Standard, which includes over 100 countries. And we also have measures from the EU to stop countries within Europe from sort of doing just that, outbidding each other. And so what we need to bear in mind is that the Paradise Papers is sort of more evidence of something that we already know goes on. And it's not sort of going to be a watershed where suddenly legislators are going to wake up and smell the money. It's going to come from a lot of work. when it comes to... Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's an important point, but to answer your question directly, I mean, we do need more international cooperation, and one of the problems is that there is no global body that deals with taxation. You know, we have an international telegraph union, we have an international postal union, we don't have a body that organises cooperation on tax affairs globally. But that's not to say that countries can't take defensive measures themselves against tax havens, and that is something that the European Union is looking at right now. You know, they're coming up with a blacklist of tax havens that they're going to publish later in the year, and the idea is that there'll be trade sanctions against those countries that appear on the list.
But is it fair that countries should appear on that list when throughout the 17 and 1800s, OECD countries weren't taxing people, and that's when their main growth happened? Is it fair that these countries that are now taking that stance should be penalised, Diego?
I don't think it is, no. And if you actually look at how these countries comply with international tax regulation and transparency, they do communicate with other treasuries from around the world. And people are aware of the financial dealings of a lot of these revelations. You know, it is not the case. As you mentioned, this is entirely legal activity. It is part of capital mobility, and we may not like the fact that some people are using perfectly legal schemes to reduce their tax bill, but it is in human nature. We all use tax exemptions and tax breaks as much as we can. Whether you're rich or poor, it depends on what instruments you use, perhaps the level of income and wealth that you have. But it is part of capital mobility. The other thing I'd like to highlight is
Before you go on that, though, it's not all perfectly legal, is it? Because, you know, when the Panama Papers were published...
No, but we're talking about the Paradise Papers here.
Yeah, but they were only leaked last week. We don't know what the consequences are going to be. You know, all the various authorities around the world want access to them.
Sorry to carry on with this, but Pascal Santamas, who's the chief economist at the OECD, hardly a pro-tax haven body, has basically said that these documents don't reveal anything controversial.
To Pascal, he doesn't know what he's talking about on this issue.
Well, he's the chief economist.
Well, for the moment, dealing with the legal, assuming that these are legal goings on, and we'll deal with potentially the illegal in a moment, what's so wrong? This is all perfectly legal, isn't it, Rachel?
So this is legal, but I mean, there are many activities that take place within the system that are cause for concern. And let's remember, it's not just tax abuses that take place. Many other activities take place behind the veil of corporate secrecy, such as corruption, fraud, other types of financial crime.
But that's different, isn't it? Where there are people legally paying less tax, do you have a problem with that?
I work for Transparency International, so we're corruption experts, not tax experts, and I'm sure George can extend in on that. But the fact is, these systems are being used by money launderers. For example, we work on the UK property market, and the Metropolitan Police looked at 130 cases over 10 years of UK houses where they suspected that corrupt money had been used to purchase these assets. And in 75% of those cases, the vehicle that had been used to move that money was an anonymous company in these tax havens using exactly the same setup to move this money around. And the fact is, a corrupt individual cannot steal public money unless they have A, a vehicle, a getaway car, and B, a safe place to hide it. And unfortunately, this system is providing that getaway vehicle.
But that gets to the crux of the matter, because just as corrupt people may in some cases use these schemes, often perfectly honest people in corrupt countries use them to be able to avoid the repression and the expropriation that happens in those places. You know, what would happen to the poor Venezuelans that have been totally impoverished by the dictatorship they are currently under if they didn't have resort to international financial centers to move some of their wealth so they're protected? In the same way that prior to World War II, Jewish Europeans who were persecuted could move their money to Switzerland, and they could benefit from banking secrecy.
But the Swiss also took in Nazi gold as well, so it's not as if the Swiss were really good arbiters in this.
If you think it's fine to expropriate people on that basis, but
the principle remains that it is a safe haven for people who are persecuted. What would you say to that, Rachel?
What I would say is that there are other ways to ensure the safety and the privacy of people who need it. Let's look at the UK's own public register of beneficial ownership. You can actually apply to the authorities to have your details redacted, and they've actually granted that. I think that at the last count to 5 people who actually had legitimate concerns. So I think there are other ways to mitigate against that rather than having just blanket secrecy within which the corrupt can hide.
But Sam, I can see Sam wants to come in.
I just think it's important to put this in perspective. Secrecy, financial secrecy, is not just a product of tax haven systems. It's very much a global thing. To put it in context with the UK, for example, I think last year they're estimated to have lost, the Exchequer is estimated to have lost about £5 billion from companies underpaying tax, whereas I think there are about £80 billion of ongoing money laundering investigations to do with schemes going on within the UK. So I think it's important to remember that tax havens are not the end of the story when it comes to all the sort of dodgy goings on.
No, indeed. And yet some of these tax havens come under UK jurisdiction, and the Chancellor's being called upon to do more. What do you want to see him do?
Well, I mean, I think the calls for the UK to take responsibility and impose beneficial ownership registers on the overseas territories and Crown dependencies is the right one. You know, it's kind of quite shameful that actually Britain sits on top of this empire of financial secrecy, and there's no reason for that. If you look at some of the other countries who continue to have territories in places like the Caribbean, like France, for example, you know, they don't foster these tax havens in the same way. So it's not as if this is a necessary condition of being a small island in the Caribbean or in the English Channel. You know, there are other ways for economic development. And I think the thing that's been lost in all of this story is actually none of this is good for the people that live in these places, right? If you look at a lot of these places, a lot of the tax havens, they have huge poverty, they have huge social issues, and the kind of 5 people that work in the financial services industry there aren't actually doing much to help that. A much better approach would be broad-based economic development that would help everyone in these places.
But what does it come down to? So the proposals that are being made come down to constraining capital mobility, making it more difficult for British people, for example, to move money not just to offshore centres but to third countries, because that is what most of the time Bermuda and the Bahamas and all these other places are used for. It's to invest in jurisdictions where you don't necessarily trust the domestic authorities to take care of your investment. You might be expropriated, you might not have recourse to appropriate courts and so on and so forth. That's why they serve a very useful purpose.
London is hardly a backwater in the financial world.
But that's not the way international investment works, because sometimes you will want a neutral jurisdiction. If you have a British investor coming together with a Russian investor, for example, or a German investor, they will not necessarily want any of those jurisdictions to be the place where disputes are settled, precisely because it wouldn't be neutral, or it may be seen as not neutral. That's why offshore centres are important in that particular regard.
Well, I think that the British courts are seen as neutral. I mean, that's absurd to think that like a German investor and a UK investor would need to go to Bermuda to settle their disputes.
You know, if you look at the figures, that's why most of the activity that happens is related to that. It's not related to avoidance.
Sam?
I mean, it's important to remember it's not just about kind of neutrality with respect to where investments are made. Another reason why we wouldn't want it to just go through the UK is that you end up with double and sometimes triple taxation on some of these investments. These funds take in money from investors all over the world. Now, if they had to put that into the UK, for example, then you would be essentially coordinating very, very different tax systems in order to work out what needs to go and where. Whereas with places like Bermuda, you kind of strip all that and have a lot of simplicity. And let's not also forget that a lot of the income that comes from these funds is eventually taxed when it goes back to those investors.
So you're essentially saying that this is useful because you don't want people to get taxed more than once, but that would be, to your point then, that you need an international body that regulates this.
Yeah, you need an international body that coordinates tax policies so that people don't come into conflict with each other. At the end of the day, like a lot of these reasons why these tax havens exist is because they're kind of falling through the cracks in the international system and abusing those gaps in the international system. Mm-hmm. So what we really need is a system which allows, like the World Trade Organization, right? The World Trade Organization is a UN body that regulates trade between nations because we accept that trade by its very nature has an impact on various different, internationally. Well, tax does as well, so we need a similar body to do that.
So what sort of regulations would you like to see that body bring in?
So, I mean, I'm not a tax expert, but kind of going back to your question about what the UK government could do, I mean, there are things they can do in their own jurisdiction right now. In fact, last year, the UK government promised to bring about a public register of the true owners of overseas companies that purchase UK property. Why is that necessary? Because at the moment you can use an overseas company to buy a property in London. Not even the land registry has to be told who you really are, and that's a huge problem. However, at the moment it's all just words from the UK government. We are yet to see the results from their consultation. We're yet to see any legislation implemented in Parliament. So there are even things they can do here in the UK to try and tackle the abuse of anonymous companies operating in this company.
Yeah, and one of the main problems here is these trust and company service providers like Mossack Fonseca that we've heard about in the Panama Papers, and Appleby in the Paradise Papers, and they allow, don't they, a sort of veneer of respectability to companies. So they have a UK address, often nothing more than a mailbox, and yet they're operating all their finances abroad, Sam.
Yes, I mean, although we have to, again, bear in mind where progress is made. Mossack Fonseca, the ones involved in the Panama Papers, as you say, were found to, I believe, have been complicit in money laundering. I don't think there are any such allegations towards Appleby yet. So we do need to recognise that not all of these firms are kind of quite so deep into the grey area as we.
But should there be more responsibility on firms? Clearly, some are doing it better than others. To take responsibility, though, when they're setting up these companies.
Well, I mean, you have to remember that what these firms are doing is trying to just get the best deal for their investors. Now, in terms of individual responsibility, you know, if some of these firms decided not to kind of develop the kinds of schemes they do, essentially, you know, what some people argue is a race to the bottom, then if they didn't do that, someone else would come in and do that for them and take their business. My key point is it's a bit misleading to focus too much on kind of individual responsibility. You know, these companies are operating in a system which allows this to take place. So,
I mean, I would agree with that last point, and I think there is actually a widespread problem with the trust and company service provider system. So, for example, last week we released some research where we looked at 766 UK companies that have been set up by these providers. They've been involved in 52 cases of grand corruption. And shockingly, half of those 700-odd companies were registered to just 8 UK addresses. A quarter of them are still active, which kind of beggars belief. How is this allowed to happen? And the problem is they're just not regulated properly. The incentives to do the right thing are just not there.
Yeah, and let's not forget, you know, the accountancy firms as well. If you look at the Paradise Papers, a lot of the schemes that have been concocted, that have been revealed, have been designed by one of the big four accountants, KPMG, PwC, Deloitte, Ernst & Young, or EY as they're now called. Well, so they have a responsibility in this, and actually, you know, all professionals have a wider responsibility to the public interest. That is the nature of being a professional, and there's no real regulation of that at the moment.
The schemes have actually been created by national tax codes, right? And this gets us to the crux of the matter, which is if you want to reduce avoidance, you need to simplify the tax code. You probably want to lower tax rates and reduce loopholes, which can be revenue neutral. You know, you don't have to sacrifice revenue for that. But the context of this whole thing is that the rich are paying more tax than ever, both as an absolute amount and as a rate of all taxation, and so are corporations. And this is for the OECD as a whole. This is not just for the UK, right? So
That's just a function of inequality, though. If you have greater inequality, then the rich pay more tax.
No, I mean, you know, it has to do with people at the top making more money, of course, but some of it also has to do with the fact that lower rates have created an incentive for people to do more and to avoid tax less.
So what incentives then does, for example, the UK need to introduce to ensure that people aren't putting their money abroad?
Well, I think they just need to enforce the system. I mean, yesterday there was a newspaper article in Italy where Italian journalists set up a company, a UK company's house, and they gave the name of the director as some well-known mafia boss, and the address is number 10 Downing Street, and no one asked any questions, right? I mean, you know, there's just very, very little regulation of the system going on.
And so you would
it's
have
bad
to
regulation.
agree.
It's not little regulation.
Right.
The tax code is the most complex in the world. It's simply that because it's so hard to navigate, not even the people working with it can understand it.
So what has to change then, in your view?
Massive simplification, lowering of tax rates. And reduce the incentive for people to use complicated schemes because the UK allows for certain loopholes to take place simply because the structure otherwise, you know, the economy couldn't work if tax codes were implemented to their fullest.
Simplification, lower tax rates. What do you make of that, Sam?
I think we need to go back one step further and really ask, are tax systems such as corporation tax really suited to the modern economy? Because as long as you have tax types like corporation tax, there will always be sort of pressure for some countries to kind of, you know, undercut others. And it's all very well to kind of call for international organizations, but I mean, you know, if you look at what happens with the UN, you know, you're still going to have your North Koreas and your, to some extent, Russias who will kind of play around with the size. So even if you bring in kind of, even if you push for sort of globally applied tax reform, there will always be this pressure. So really we need to kind of think, are there other ways that, because really what we want to do is make sure that the government has enough revenues. So corporation tax is not the only way to do that. we can move away from corporation tax and sort of shift it towards more taxation of individuals. So I think it's time to think more seriously about that.
Hugely regressive. That would be hugely regressive. It would be handing money to the rich and taking it from the poor.
But
if you did
Sam's
that.
right. You can't get everyone to agree. You can't get everyone to agree to these regulations, which is what you want.
Well, I mean, I just want regulations to be enforced, right? And also I want people to agree on what is the proper way to tax stuff. But what I don't want is a more regressive tax system, and getting rid of corporation tax and taxing more on individuals would be a more regressive tax system.
That's not quite so, because half of the tax burden of corporation tax is paid by workers in the form of lower wages, actually. So it's not clear that it would be regressive at all. And there's no evidence for it either. It's an argument it's a common misunderstanding that corporations are owned by the rich and therefore the rich benefit if corporation tax goes down. It's not true, because the burden actually falls on somebody else, and more everybody owns corporations because we all have pension savings and we have ISAs and so on and so forth. So actually, no, it's not regressive.
Okay, we can debate about how tax systems should be changed within countries. The fact is, though, even though this is legal, it just sort of smells fishy, doesn't it? When the Icelandic PM was found to be investing offshore, even though it wasn't illegal, he lost his position because people just don't like it. It doesn't feel fair, does it?
No, and I mean, if we look back to the Panama Papers, there have been specific corruption cases that have come out of that. In fact, more widely in terms of abuse, I think there have been about 150 separate investigations or inquiries set up by 79 countries in the last 18 months. I think they've recovered $110 million worth of assets and unpaid taxes. So there has been some criminality that has taken place over the last 18 months, and I would not be surprised if we see similar cases emerging from what's happened with Appleby over the last week or so.
It remains to be seen. You were talking, Sam, about people being taxed twice, and obviously that's not fair too, but presumably a lot of money is being moved around without being taxed at all.
Do you have any examples?
That could be, for example, in the UK, how much money is being lost to these offshore havens that would otherwise be taxed in the UK?
I'm not sure about the exact figures, but...
So one figure that is thrown out by the OECD, and I think this is a higher estimate, is $140 billion, which to give you an idea, is 1% of US GDP. So you're not talking, given that US GDP is about 20% of global GDP, you're not talking about a very large number. We make it seem like this is massive tax avoidance happening. First of all, it's a product of the tax codes, and then secondly, compared to the size of the world economy, it's actually not that much.
That's the OECD number. The IMF says 600 billion a year, and it's 25% of corporate profits.
Which tells you how much guesswork is involved in all of this, right? Because everybody has different figures.
And it's not just about tax, it's also about public money. So money that could be running through these anonymous companies, this could be money that's meant to be in a healthcare budget or going towards education in a developing country or infrastructure. But yet the system is enabling corrupt individuals to take that money, funnel it through anonymous companies and park it somewhere safe. So we've got to look at that aspect as well. Where is the harm really being done?
There's a value to fairness.
Of course. Can we expect the UK to do anything, Sam? We've seen the former Prime Minister, former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown, calling for action. Is that actually going to happen, or is this all talk?
Well, I mean, we already have had action. I mean, if you take, for example, the so-called Google tax brought in 2 years ago, this is designed to tackle basically very complex systems whereby entities shift around profits, entities based in different jurisdictions shift around profits between each other despite belonging to the same multinational body. That has actually already had some effect on companies' behaviours. So, for example, since the tax was brought in, I think there's been about 260 million more brought into the Exchequer. Half of that has not been brought in through the Google tax itself, but through companies instead deciding to pay corporation tax rather than go through this whole process. So we have seen clear ways in which corporations' behaviour has changed.
OK, but that's not highlighted in the media. The fact that the Queen and other big names have got money invested offshore this is a bit of a sort of media storm, isn't it, George?
Well, I do agree, actually, that some of the stories that have come out is a bit of a distraction, and actually the real issue is the systemic one. And actually, I agree with you that the tax system does need to be simplified, right, in the sense that if we have clearer rules that are simpler to enforce and enforced, then that would be fairer for everyone. And actually, I think the media needs to concentrate a lot more on that. But the policy agenda is always much more difficult to cover than the celebrity scandal.
Some consensus here then.
Yeah, I mean, let's go back one step further. You know, the reason why we're angry about tax avoidance is because of poverty and inequality. And let's not get carried away. You know, it's not like the only thing that's standing between us and greater prosperity is a few thousand tax dodgers. Really, we should be focusing on how to kind of lift up a very unproductive economy. You know, when we're talking about tax avoidance, we're sort of squabbling about how to cut up the pie, the economy. We should be talking about how to grow it for everyone. So that's really what will kind of bring about sort of substantive change.
And again, the broader story in the last 30 or 40 years is that extreme poverty has gone down massively, global inequality is declining, and a lot of it, I would say, has to do with investment happening in poor places, and a lot of that has been enabled through offshore centers, or tax havens, if you want to call them that. So the story is not as simple as people like to tell it, precisely because, as you were saying, the media like hearing more about the Queen's estate's dealings and so on.
But
Very briefly.
Yeah, well, you know, there is also evidence from the IMF, which was published last year, to show that more equal societies do grow faster. It's higher growth rates in more equal societies. So the inequality issue is of prime importance.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all my guests today. So financial structures have allowed offshore investment companies to work the system, but should the moral argument prevail over money? That was Roundtable with me, Vanessa Cuddiford.